Today's daf is daf Ayin Zion, and we began discussing on the bottom of Ayin Vav Amid Beis a concept called Gidin Shesofan Lahakshos, and this has to do with sinews. There are certain sinews that are soft and others that are hard. And the question is whether or not these sinews have the status of basar, because we said that if a leg, the hind legs of an animal are fractured, then if the fractured bone is covered by basar, by flesh, then the halacha works with the assumption that the breakage can be remedied and the parts of the bone will come together, like we have a cast in our time, right? So the flesh itself that covers this fracture will be able to accomplish that goal. Now, the Gemara tells a story here about a young pigeon that had a broken leg. And the question was whether or not, in addition to the flesh that covered the broken leg, there was also skin. And the question is, can we integrate both the skin and the flesh in order to make the bird fit for eating through shechita, obviously? And the Gemara says that this is really an issue. Why? Because apparently there's one opinion that says that you have to have mostly flesh, and then you could add and integrate a little bit of the skin, and the skin can then be integrated, but only if the skin is secondary. And yet, when the question actually came up in the story, Rav Yitzchak was machshir the bird, even though it had an equal measure of flesh and skin. And the Gemara sort of objects to that because we need majority of flesh and only a minority of skin. But Gemara then rejects it and says, well, a young pigeon is different, and we cannot compare that to an animal because the pigeon itself has very soft skin. And therefore, if we want to integrate the R together with the basar, we can do that even if it's 50-50 in the case of a young pigeon, but not in the case of an animal, because in an animal, the Gemara says that the R is very tough, and it's not like flesh, and it cannot really protect this breakage. Anyway, the Gemara then goes on, as we saw yesterday, and presents another case, in a case of an animal that had a broken leg. And the case came in front of Rava, and Rava said that it's fine, that you could integrate the gidin, which are soft, together with the flesh, in order to get this rove that covers the fracture, and then you could be machshir the animal. And when Rava took this lenient ruling, he justified himself on two counts. And the first count was that according to Rabbi Yochanan, and we can rely on Rabbi Yochanan, we have the category called Gidin Shesofan Lahakshos, which we said are sinews that, although right now, presently, they're in a state of being soft, they'll eventually harden. And Rabbi Yochanan allowed a person to be registered as part of a chabura for a korban pesach, because these sinews, since they're eventually going to harden, are considered like flesh, so that if you register and you have ownership rights amongst the group on the korban pesach, on the lamb, then it's considered as if you own part of the flesh of the land, of the lamb. And furthermore, says Rava, I have another basis for my conclusion that you can be machshir the animal by integrating the sinews together with the flesh, and that is based on a principle called haTorah chasa al mamonim shel Yisrael, meaning that if we want to decide whether to rely on Rabbi Yochanan, who's Mekil in this case, we could say that the Torah has mercy on the money of Israel. So what's at stake here is an animal that was shechted, and now you want to know whether it's a treifa or kosher. We're going to rely on Rabbi Yochanan and say that we're integrating the sinews with the flesh in order to be machshir the animal, because the Torah is concerned about the financial loss, which is somewhat significant if we're going to treif up the animal. And the Gemara is going to object to that second approach, because if you have doubts as to whether or not the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan, and in this particular case, Reish Lakish rejects Rabbi Yochanan, then you're talking about a suffix whether or not the animal is treif. That's a suffix d'oraisa. You can't say that the Torah is going to be lenient because of the financial loss. You could stretch it in cases of, let's say, what's the classic case is that the Torah says that the Kohen is about to declare that this bias is a bias of negatzaras, which is called nigei batim, and therefore everything in the house is going to have to go up in smoke. It's all going to be destroyed. So now we're going to say, well, before the Kohen goes ahead and makes his declaration, determining and establishing that the bias is tamei, then first clear out everything in the house. And we're going to do that because the Torah says that the Kohen should actually go ahead and command the people in the family to clear out the house before the Kohen declares that this is a Tamei Tumas Negoim. Okay, that's something else. That's not a case of a Safek Iser Doraisa. So this is going to be the objection of Rav Papa to Rava. And that's where we're going to start today on the second line on Ayin Zayin. Amalei Rav Papa le Rava, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. After all, Reish Lakish rejects Rabbi Yochanan, and he's not willing to integrate soft gidin rak, and soft sinew to the flesh in order to be machshir the animal and determine that it's not treifa, but it's fit for shchita, based on the fact that these sinews, although they're soft now, will eventually harden. And therefore, since we have Rav Shimon ben Lakish, Isur Doraisa, now, you know what? In the controversy and the debate between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, we should paskin l'chumra. V'ata Amrit, and you, Rava, say, my nachishla? You definitely want to accept Rabbi Yochanan and rely on Rabbi Yochanan. Ishtik. So Rav had nothing to say on his own behalf. In fact, the Gemara, V'amai Ishtik. Why would Rava be silent in the face of Rav Papa's argument? V'amar Rava hilchsa kavasi Rav Shimon ben Lakish klas, that in all the controversies and debates throughout Shas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, we will always paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, except for three cases. There are only three exceptions to that rule, and this is not one of them. And therefore, since this is not listed as one of the three, this is Sugin Yevamas on Daf Lamed Vav. Therefore, the implication is that certainly Rava paskins like Rabbi Yochanan. And if that be the case, then why is Rav Papa attacking Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan is perfectly justified in relying, I'm sorry, Rava is perfectly justified in relying on Rabbi Yochanan because we always pass like Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish. So the Gemara says that you're missing the point over here. The reason why Rav Papa is objecting to the psak of Rava is because Shani Hacha to Hadabe Rabbi Yochanan Legabe Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Because ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan conceded that Reish Lakish is correct, and the fact that in the case of a Korban Pesach, you want to say, well, you know what, these sinews are like flesh because they're ultimately going to harden. No, no, no. Rabbi Yochanan rescinded that position, and ultimately he embraced the position of Reish Lakish, conceding that Reish Lakish was correct. And that's why it's not listed as one of the exceptional cases where he paskin like Reish Lakish against Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan himself conceded that he accepts the shita of Reish Lakish. And if that be the case in the animal, which we're not sure if it's treif or not treif, and we're going to accept Reish Lakish that you cannot integrate the soft sinews, even though this so far eventually they'll get a hard in order to salvage the animal and decide that it's not treifa. Therefore, Rav Papa doesn't understand how could Rava rule that we can eat the behemoth, that we can eat this animal. The Amar Le. Now the Gemara wants to prove that Rabbi Yochanan accepted Reish Lakish. Al taknikeni b'loshen yachid anishona osa. That in a discussion between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, which we'll see later on Kuf Chaf Beis, and they were talking about the case of a hide of a tender calf that eventually will become tough. Is it susceptible to tumah like basar, like flesh, even though it's soft and it's not really like basar? And Rabbi Yochanan said, you know what? It's not makabel tumah. And why is it? Because it will harden. And therefore, it's going to harden, even though now it's got a very striking similarity to flesh, and it's soft, but nevertheless it will eventually harden. So Reish Lakish attacked him from a Mishnah, and the Mishnah has a list of many parts of an animal's hide that are considered like flesh, and on the list we have the hide of the head of this tender calf. So Rabbi Yochanan himself had taught that Mishnah to the students. So now the question is, well, how could Rabbi Yochanan contradict the very Mishnah that he presented? And Rabbi Yochanan replies, don't get me angry. Don't challenge me from that Mishnah. Because according to me, that Mishnah is only a Dasi Yochid. It's a minority opinion. It's one single Tana, and we don't accept that Tana. So although Rabbi Yochanan initially allowed someone to register on the Korban Pesach as part of the Chabura based on the soft sinews of a Pesach, because they're ultimately going to harden, and therefore he wanted to consider it flesh, that's based on that Mishnah that Reish Lakish had quoted to object to Rabbi Yochanan, based on the fact that the flesh that will harden is considered as if it was hard already. And therefore, it's already not, it's right now, it's not makabel tumah, even though right now it's soft. But Rabbi Yochanan himself, by saying, why are you hitting me with a Mishnah that's a das yochid, indicates that he himself would no longer rely on that Mishnah, but rather would retract his original position. And then, with regard to the Korban Pesach, we could not sign this guy up for the Korban Pesach, because right now it's soft. And if that be the case, then we understand that when you have a broken bone and it's covered with soft sinew, that's not flesh, even though eventually it'll be like flesh, but now it's too soft. And now we go on back to the Gemara. Hu nishbar ha'etzem v'yotzel lechutz. Okay, so the bone was fractured and it broke through the skin, and it was covered by flesh and skin. Dishtakil kurtisa mine. Part of the bone fell off, and now, if we look at the situation of the bone, we're going to say that it's treifa because of the fact that a chip of the bone fell off. Also, Lakami Abaye, the case came in front of Abaye, and Shayet Losarigli. Abaye had questions. He didn't know for sure what to paskin. He wanted to discuss it with the Talmidei Chachamim. And in those days, they used to assemble during the Moadim, and he waited 3 Moadim to try to figure out if they could help him resolve this issue. And nevertheless, he was not successful. They didn't have an answer. Amalei Rav Ada bar Masna. So therefore, Rav Ada bar Masna tells that the owner of the animal who has this suffix, you know what? Zil kami de Rava Breda Rav Yosef bar Chama. That's Rava, the famous Rava. The Charife Sakina, he's sharp as a knife, meaning he has penetrating mind. He'll be able to resolve this. Also, kami de Rava. And Omar, and Rava says, Michti, Nishbara Etzem, V'yotzel Lechutz Tnan. The Mishnah itself explicitly addresses your question about a fractured bone, and the bone penetrated through the skin, and the brisa was makil and allowed eating the meat of this animal because the skin, together with the flesh, covered most of the bone. And therefore, Mali Nafal, Mali Isay. Although the Mishnah is explicitly addressing a case where the bone or no part of the bone fell off, but Rava says we can derive from the Mishnah, it doesn't matter whether Nafal or Mandi Isay, whether or not part of the bone fell off or the entire bone is still there. The main point is that if you have skin and flesh, and they cover the major portion of the bone, then it's permissible. Amalei Ravina L'Rava, mislakit mai. Now we have a whole list of sveikos in terms of the skin and the flesh that cover the major portion of the broken bone. Mislakit. What is mislakit? Mislakit means, let's say you have skin and flesh, but it's not contiguous. It's spread out in different areas. Can we integrate them all together to make up rov? Or misroses mahu? What about a case where the flesh is flattened? That's called misroses. So basically what you have is, if you sort of like compress the skin, then it becomes a very thin layer. And maybe that's not enough to protect the animal from dying from this wound. Mismasmes mahu. What happens if the flesh itself that covers the bone is decayed? So on that last question, he says, Hechidomi mismasmes, Amar of Huna Bereder of Yeshua Kol Sharofe Kodro, that if you took the animal and showed its flesh that was decaying to an expert, to a doctor, a veterinarian, he would start carving away, which means that he believed that you could still heal the animal. And therefore, in your last question, the answer is that the animal is still kosher. Iboilahu, now another suffix. Nikev mahu. What if there are holes in the flesh? that's covering the greater portion of the bone. And these holes were punctured with a needle. None of them is missing, but again, it's weakening the flesh and therefore doesn't really have the ability to save the animal's life. Or niklaf ma'u, what happens if you peel away the flesh that covers the bone? This actually is very much related to the question that we had before about mismasmes. Anyway, niklaf ma'u or nistak ma'u. What happens if the flesh has splits in it? There's enough flesh, but it's split open. Nital shlish atachto ma'u. What if the bottom third of the flesh was removed? So you have 2/3 remaining. And once again, we don't know in a case where the flesh was peeled away from the bone and now it was replaced. Let's say the flesh starts regenerating itself. Do we assume that the animal remains kosher? Because at the end of the day, none of the flesh is missing. But here, in the case with the animal, its lowest layer of flesh was removed. Maybe in that case, it won't regenerate itself, and the bone that's broken is going to cause the death of the animal. Toshma, we learned in a statement that's attributed to Rabbi Yochanan Bar Ulam, Rabbi Yochanan, or Hareu Kibasa, that the R, we had a whole discussion about this, has the same status as the basa. So the skin is equivalent to the flesh, and it covers the bone. And the Gemara assumes that we're talking about a case where the flesh beneath the skin was removed, and all you have is the flesh above the skin plus the R, and the hide, the skin, and Rabbi Yochanan paskin that the animal is kosher. So therefore, we certainly would say that if 2/3 of the thickness of the flesh remains, that's enough to integrate with the skin and create a valid covering that would protect the animal. Dilma, the Gemara says that's not a proof. To kana mashka dide. Maybe that's a case where the bone is attached to the skin. So that skin is really attached to the bone. And since the bone is fractured, and let's say right there's no flesh, because as we said, some of the flesh was removed. But since the skin hugs the bone, therefore Rabbi Yochanan says it has the equivalent status of flesh, of basar, and therefore the animal is kosher. Now this more or less ends the major bulk of the sugya of all the sveikas of the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't seem to come to any resolution. And even in the last case, where we found that 1/3 of the thickness of the flesh was removed, even then the Gemara says that really doesn't prove anything, because that's a case where Rabbi Yochanan would say that since the skin took hold of the bone and it's attached firmly to the bone, that's why it could protect the bone. When we were in the yeshiva, Beirav Papi, we asked him the following question: Nikdar kimin tabas mahu. Okay, so for this we have a picture. The literal translation of the Gemara is the flesh was carved away like a ring around the area of the fracture. So we have a picture of it here. The greater portion of the fractured bone is covered with skin and flesh, but a ring of flesh has been carved away around the covering. So the covering consists of a patch that is completely separated from the rest of the basar, of the animal's flesh. Is it possible for the missing flesh to regenerate? So the patch covering the fracture can be reconnected to the rest of the animal's flesh. So the Gemara says, "U poshat," and we came to a conclusion. Meihad Yom Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Dover zeh shalti l'chacham l'rofim. I asked the scholars and the veterinarians, the Amru, and they responded that misorto bi etzem umala rucha. You can only use the bone itself to scratch the flesh, and somehow it's like magic to me that if you use the bone of that particular animal, you scratch the flesh, then it causes bleeding, and then the animal will regenerate and grow connective tissue. And that's what the veterinarians advocate. Volparza, Mizraf, Zorid, but if you'll take metal, something to abrade the flesh, you'll only aggravate the wound. Anyway, we see that the flesh can regenerate. Therefore, the animal is fit for shchita. Amar Rav Papa, for who? But this only a case applies to kana garma dide. The bone was somehow able to take hold of its own flesh. The bone around the missing ring has flesh firmly attached to it, indicated that the rejuvenative process has begun. Now this leads us to the Mishnah of Shilya. So this is a very gory Mishnah. You know, if you're a sensitive soul, you don't want to learn all these. It's all about a miscarriage. So shilya is the sac in which the what you call the fetus develops. Now he slaughters the animal, obviously a female animal, and he finds inside the animal the shilya, the amniotic sac. So the Mishnah says you're allowed to eat it, but only if you're a nefesh yafa, which means that you're not repulsed by it, and there's no bal tishaktu, because the shilya that you want to eat was never born. And if it was never born because you found it inside the animal, then the shechita, the mother, will be matir the consumption of the shilya. And furthermore, ein mitama. The shilya does not have the status of tumah, lo tumas ochlin velo tumas nevelos. So in order to contract tumas ochlin, you have to have something that's normally eaten. And although a nefesh yafa would eat it, but most people would not eat it, and therefore it doesn't have a shem ochel, and it's not makabel tumas ochlin. But as far as nevela is concerned, as we said, the shechita of the mother is meaningful for the shilya, and technically you're allowed to eat the shilya, and for sure it's not nevela. However, even though we said that as a general rule, something that's not normally eaten is not metami tumas ochlin, doesn't have a shem ochel, but only in the absence of chishav alef. But if chishav alef, you declare in your mind that you're going to eat it, that already changes the status, and it now becomes an ochel, and therefore it's metami tumas ochel. Avalo tumas nevelas. Right? The fact that you want to eat it is not going to make it into a nevela. I don't know exactly why the Mishnah had to point that out. It seems so obvious. Okay. We go on. Now, until now, we're talking about finding a shilya inside the mother's womb, but now we're going to talk about a case where at least part of the shilya already left the mother's womb. Shilya shiyatza miktsasa. Now, once the shilya is born, then the shechita, the mother, is no longer effective for the shilya, and therefore asur b'achila. And the chiddush of the Mishnah is that even though the shilya only partially emerged from the womb of its mother, nevertheless, the shechita cannot be matir the shilya, and the entire shilya, even that part that remained inside the womb, is also. And the chiddush is that miktzah shilya means only a small part, a minority of the shilya has exited from its mother's womb. And that small part could not possibly contain the entire fetus. So why are we worried about this? Why does the Mishnah paskin that yotza miktzot asur b'achila? And the answer is, says Rashi, because we're worried that perhaps the head of this miscarried fetus actually exited from its mother's body. You know, the parts of the fetus are all I'm looking for a word in English, but they're all mishkababbled, they're dissolved and you really can't look and determine, where the head is or anything else, but maybe the head was in that smaller part of the shilya that came out. And that itself would make it into a leda. As we've discussed in the past, the head going out of the mother's womb creates leda, and therefore the shechita of the mother would no longer be effectuate a heter for the shilya. Now, let me just take a moment here to remind myself that there's another possible issue over here. Okay, I'm just going to throw something out. Hopefully we'll pick it up later on today. And that is what's inside the shilya? Is it one fetus or two? Maybe they're twins. Because now you're telling me that you can't eat the shilya, even that part of the shilya that didn't exit its body because it's already born. But if there's another shilya inside, that's a separate fetus, a separate being, that l'chorah you should be allowed to eat. Or do we assume that one shilya per customer, one vlad per customer? Let's go on. Siman vlad b'isha, v'siman vlad b'behem. In other words, we're going to compare a human female giving birth to an animal female giving birth. And in both cases, mixashilya is enough to generate that, again, asur b'achila is referring to an animal shilya, but the principle is the same, that we're always afraid that maybe the head of the fetus emerged. And then we have to determine what's the status of the female mother who gave birth. We don't know whether she's giving birth to a male or a female, and the laws of Tumah V'Tara will depend upon that. So we've got a whole stuff. Okay. Now the Mishnah goes on to discuss a different case of a miscarriage, and that's an animal that's giving birth for the first time. So we have what's called Kedushas Bechor. Hamavakeres, Vakeres means its first birth. He pila shilya. Now the animal has a miscarriage. And now the question is there Kedushas Bechor? So the Mishnah says, Yashlichenu leklovim, meaning you're allowed to have hana from it, even though l'chora there's at least a 50% chance that this is a male and therefore it's a bechor. And if it's a bechor, then you have to bring it to the mizbeach. But okay, you can't bring a shilya to the mizbeach, but nevertheless it has the kedusha of a bechor. And therefore, how could you How can you throw it to the garbage, to the dogs? But the answer is the following. We have a 50-50% chance that that shilya, that fetus was male or female. And the Bechor is only applicable to the male. And even if you'll tell me that it was a male, there's another percentage of a possibility that it would not be sanctified with Kedushas Bechor because it has a different appearance. It doesn't, had it developed, it would not develop in the appearance of its mother, but rather, let's say it was a goat and the appearance would be that of a sheep. So there's no Kedushas Bechor in that case. And that tips the scale. So we have a rove to say that it doesn't have Kedushas Bechor, and therefore we could shove it to the dogs. However, the Mukdashim, if let's say the mother animal was sanctified, let's say for a carbon shlomim, because you could have a female shlomim, now we have to be very careful about the vlad, because the vlad of mukdashim, whether it's male or female, would make no difference. Again, it's only going to be kadosh, this fetus, if it looks like its mother, if you know what I'm saying. But the possibility that it won't look like its mother, a sheep gives birth to a goat is like 1 in a billion. So we have to consider that it's got kedushas shlomim, and therefore tikaver, we have to bury it. Now we have halacha of what's called darkei amori. Amori is one of 7 nations that occupied Palestine, and they were all idol worshippers, and we're not allowed to imitate them. And amongst the Amoraim, when they had a miscarriage, they would take that miscarriage, that fetus, that unborn fetus, and they would bury it. And where would they bury it? Al Parshas Drachim, right, at a fork in the road. And then, this is crazy, but this is all part of their idolatry, they would hang it up on a tree. So we're not allowed to do that because the Torah says that we're not allowed to imitate the Amorites, lotase kimasehem, or perhaps Rashi quotes the pasuk v'chukosehem lo selechu, and therefore ein kovrin osan al parshas drachim v'ein tolin osan be'ilon mivnei darkei ha'amori. So as we're going to learn, you can only imitate the darkei amori if it's beneficial scientifically, medically. Otherwise, it looks like the suspicion of an avodah zarah. Now the Gemara asks the following: how do we know, minani lili, that if part of the shilya came out, even if it's a small part, nevertheless we consider it as if it was born? Ton Rabbanon kol behemoth tochelim l'rabos hashilya. Okay, so if you find the shilya inside of its mother, then you're allowed to eat it through the shechita of the mother. But yochla afilu yotza miktsasa, you might extend that to say that the Torah is marba, even in case where part of the amniotic sac already came out of its mother's womb. Talmud Lomar osa. Now we have a mute. So we started with a ribui. We could have taken the ribui to its extreme, to its logical conclusion, but then we have a mute, osa below shil yasa. And this pasuk of osa, which excludes shil yasa, is coming to the case where miktas shilya was expelled from the mother's womb. Michbit. Ain't shilya below vlad. Why do you need a drasha for this? Can't we derive this logically? Because if there's an amniotic sac, then there's got to be a fetus inside. So lamali kra, right? We surely have to be choshesh that maybe the head of the fetus exited from the mother's womb, and therefore it's considered leda, and therefore the mother's shechita could not be valid for the amniotic sac that has inside it a fetus, cross matzabi. We don't really need the post. Then the Mishnah says, "V'eino there is no tumah that would apply to the fetus, the miscarriage that you found inside the mother's womb, by Rabbi Yitzchak, Barnaf, or Chamor." Okay, so now we get to a donkey. Sheshloko Mahu. He overly cooks the hide of a donkey. What's this all about? Lamai. Ilatumas Ochlin. If this is what Rabbi Yitzchak wants to tell me, that you can somehow make this hide into an edible, and therefore it's makabel tumas ochlin, by virtue of the fact that he overcooks it, tanina, that we have in a brisa. And if we have it in a brisa, we don't understand why Rabbi Yitzchak had to tell me that which we have in a brisa.